Animal rights groups say that it is unacceptable for government to allow people to hunt endangered animals for the purpose of collecting trophies. Now, this after the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment announced this year's trophy hunting quotas. Let's unpack the consequences of this decision for wildlife, especially those that are endangered. And joining me now to do this is Andrew Taylor, and he's a trade program manager at the Endangered Wildlife Trust. Thank you very much for your time this evening, Andrew. I was going through the quotas that have been set by the department, and I tend to agree with the fact that it's actually quite worrying that we are seeing the quotas that were published by the ministry.
Yeah, good evening. Thanks for having me on. So I think that the position or the perspective of the Endangered Wildlife Trust is that trophy hunting can actually be a very positive tool for conservation of biodiversity. Now, I realize that might seem a little bit of a controversial thing to say, and there are a number of people, many people who would disagree with that and cannot really understand it. But the reality is that trophy hunting, under the right circumstances, can actually generate significant income revenues for the country and can generate significant revenues that can be recycled back into conservation. So trophy hunting can generate money to allow people, incentivize people to protect land for wildlife itself.
But what are the consequences of, you're speaking about the positive that we could get out of it in terms of revenue collection, particularly for industries that were battered by the pandemic. But generally talking, from an endangered species point of view, the consequences that could come out of this.
Right, so I think the three species in particular that are being referred to here and that the government has changed the quota for are the leopard, the black rhino and the African elephant. And in all three cases, in all three species, if guidelines that the government sets following quotas very strictly and all the sort of guidelines around how you hunt individual species, these particular three species, if those guidelines are followed, then the benefits there are actually net positive benefits to these three species. Of course, there is potential for corrupt practices. There is potential for people not following the guidelines. And under those situations or those circumstances, then it could be problematic because all three species are threatened according to the IUCN. But reality is if this hunting is implemented in a responsible manner and the quotas are followed and the rules around which animals are hunted in particular, and those sort of rules are set by experts who work with the government to define those. If those guidelines are followed, then there should be no negative impact on those three species.
Yeah, and I'm glad you bring that up because it's an important point, the corruption, the lack of oversight in terms of making sure that these quotas or the regulation around these quotas is followed to the T. In the past, in your experience, have you found that it's difficult for there to be significant oversight to ensure that the rules are being followed properly?
Yeah, yes, so it can be. So I think let me give you one example where it would be quite straightforward to make sure the guidelines are followed. For example, with the black rhino, the quota is now 10. It's actually 0.5% of the black rhino population. The guidelines are very strict in terms of which animals can be hunted, where they can be hunted, and there is very strict oversight by the African Rhino Specialist Group and the Rhino Management Group. They have complete oversight on which animals can be hunted. So in that case, there's unlikely to be a problem. But in other areas, for example, the hunting of carnivores, when there were no quotas historically, or where there were other quotas, or different quotas, I should say, sorry, and if there is not clear and strict monitoring of that process, then it is definitely possible that more animals would be hunted than is said by the quotas. So it is something that needs to be checked, and I think a very important aspect of all this would be very strict monitoring. So the government, provincial governments, the national government could have monitors that attend the hunts. For example, with the leopard, with the leopard hunting, they've set a very strict guideline that only males over 7 years of age can be hunted. And it is my understanding from colleagues who are carnivore experts that if that was followed very strictly, it's unlikely to have a negative impact. But of course, it's very difficult to determine how old a leopard is. And that would therefore require strict monitoring.
No, absolutely. Andrew, how do we compare with the rest of the world in terms of implementing sustainable offtake or quotas of this nature? How does South Africa compare to other countries around the world?
So sustainable use is really, it's only really, within Africa, it's mainly practiced within Southern Africa. So South Africa, Namibia, Zimbabwe, Zambia, Mozambique, Botswana, those countries. So we would only really be able to compare ourselves with those countries. It's not necessarily implemented in some other African countries. And we have a really strongly growing wildlife economy sector, which uses sustainable use as sort of its foundations. So we compare very favorably in terms of the size of our sustainable use system. But if you're asking in terms of whether we are governing it properly, whether our governance is good, I think it depends on what species we're talking about and what the activity is. But I think in many areas we sort of come out favorably. We do have significant oversight, and we have, because South Africa has more financial resources than many of the other African countries, we do tend to monitor things more accurately. But that doesn't mean to say that we couldn't do better. And I think for our sustainable use policies to be successful in the long term, we will have to make sure that we are implementing them responsibly.
And as we implement them responsibly, we have to bear in mind that doing so does benefit marginalized communities who otherwise wouldn't have any form of income coming in from anywhere.
Yes, so that is very true. I think, and we're seeing across Southern Africa, I think a country that's is frequently sort of suggested to be the country that's really leading the way would be Namibia. But South Africa is really moving towards or trying to bring communities, marginalized and impoverished communities, into our wildlife economy. And I think there is great potential for the wildlife economy, and including sustainable use, to benefit our marginalized communities. I do think it's really important to recognize that our wildlife economy cannot resolve all of our problems. You know, we have a lot of poverty still in South Africa, and that, you know, there are other really big issues that need to be dealt with aside from the wildlife economy. So while the wildlife economy can make a really positive contribution, it cannot be expected to do everything.
Absolutely. Andrew Taylor from the Endangered Wildlife Trust, thank you very much for joining us this evening, speaking to us about the quotas that have been set by the Department of Environment and Fisheries around trophy hunting in the country.